Hi, I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies, the American Enterprise Institute. Delighted to have all of you with us today, both those of you with us here and those of you watching the live stream. Today's event is Moneyball for Education, Bipartisan Approaches to Improving Student Outcomes by Investing in What Works. We are going to have a presentation for you on a new paper that we've penned on precisely this topic. And then we are privileged to have just an all-star lineup of some folks who've thought deeply about this and tackled it. And they're going to come up and we'll get to have a conversation with them about some of the issues raised and how to tackle it. First off, I want to thank the Bloomberg Philanthropies for the generous support that made this endeavor possible. I want to ask folks in the audience if they'd please turn off their cell phones. And for those of you guys who want to follow along on Twitter, the hashtag is Moneyball4Ed. That's Moneyball number 4 Ed. All right. So what is Moneyball? Those of you in this room are probably familiar with the term. Michael Lewis wrote a wonderful book more than a decade ago now called Moneyball, tracking the success, the unexpected success of the Oakland A's, a small market baseball team, which despite spending a whole lot less than a lot of its deep-pocketed competitors, the New York Yankees of the world, had a run of doing remarkably well by hiring, in particular, players who other folks didn't think were that valuable, drafting players other folks thought were weird picks, and then going on to great success. Turned out that what Oakland had tapped into under general manager Billy Beane was the understanding that you could learn lots of stuff about how good people were at baseball, lots of stuff about how to play the game well that teams weren't aware of, weren't paying attention to, and were overlooking. Turned out that rather than pay millions and millions for a guy who would hit 30 home runs a year, you could actually win more games by paying a tenth of that to somebody who got on base a lot. Turned out to be a revolutionary book in a lot of ways. Was a movie that I think won Jonah Hill an Oscar, which nobody saw coming. But also, just if you look across the landscape of professional sports, you see huge impact on the NBA, on the NFL, on the way people think and talk about the value of players and about how to play the game well. And you've also seen the impact just across popular culture, particularly in a number of sectors where folks have used those insights to try to chase efficiencies. In education, we sometimes talk about it, but one of the tricks is it's not clear we've necessarily spent a lot of time thinking about what Moneyball really is, how it works, or how to bring it to bear. Moneyball is not just about trying to figure out which programs give you the biggest reading and math score jumps. It's really about trying to figure out all those opportunities to help children learn better, all those opportunities for teachers to teach better that we don't observe, that we don't see, that we might overlook because we're looking in the wrong places or with the wrong tools. With my good friend Bethany Little, who's at Ed Council, and with the wonderful folks at Results for America, what we've done is we've got together a whole bunch of smart people who've tackled these issues from a variety of perspectives. District leaders, folks who've worked on these issues in the U.S. Department of Education, on Capitol Hill, academics, and have tried to have some conversations about what would it look like? Where can we find some common ground, even in these relatively fractious times, where we can talk about ways to push forward this effort to bring the intuitions of Moneyball to bear in education. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. First up is going to be Bethany Little, who's going to take 10 minutes, give or take, and walk you through just some of the key takeaways of what we came out with in this new paper. It's available right here, and it's also available online at both the Results for America and on the AEI websites. Bethany is a consultant to Results for America and a principal at Education Council. She was formerly a managing partner at America Achieves. Many folks in this town know her well from her long history of leadership on these issues, where she was chief education counsel to the chairman of the Senate Help Committee. And, Bethany has worked closely with an array of Democratic all-stars, from Ted Kennedy back to Patty Murray to Senator Tom Harkin. Bethany, would you please come on up?
So this has been a really terrific project to work on, and I'm really grateful to Results for America and to Bloomberg Philanthropies for this opportunity, and of course to Rick for this great partnership. Rick and I usually play for different teams, and I mean like all-time rival different teams, Yankees, Red Sox. It's terrific to be on the same diamond playing together. I'm thinking for the Nationals today in this work. And this teamwork is possible because this agenda around using data, evidence, innovation to drive better outcomes is supposed to be common sense, but it's really not the way things often work in policy. As a recovering policymaker, I all too often had to make pretty large decisions about directions of education policy without the data and evidence that would have made those better decisions. And so I'm grateful to RFA and to Rick for their leadership, to Rick for bringing his intellectual rigor and his great sense of humor to the work that we've been doing over the past few months to make this possible. So let's talk about what do we mean by Moneyball for government. Hill people never do PowerPoints, so I'm still very new to this thing, so bear with me. So in 2012, Results for America launched the Moneyball for Government campaign, which is working to encourage government at all levels to increase their use of evidence and data when investing limited taxpayer dollars. There are three basic principles in Moneyball. One is about building evidence, about the practices, policies, and programs that are going to achieve the most effective and efficient results so that policymakers can make better decisions. The second one is about investing limited taxpayer dollars in practices, policies, and programs that use data, evidence, and evaluation to demonstrate that they work. And the third is to direct funds away from practices, policies, and programs that consistently fail to achieve their measurable outcomes. That's common sense, right? Luckily, it is to a growing number of leaders in a lot of sectors. RFA has pulled together, Results for America has pulled together experts from a number of fields and from across the political spectrum to advocate for government making more informed decisions using data and evidence. You can see some of the examples up here of Republicans and Democrats at the federal level, 17 current and former mayors from across the nation. We've got everyone from Mayor de Blasio in New York to Mayor Garcetti in Los Angeles. And then rounding out the all-star lineup, we've got 58 leaders and visionaries from education nonprofits, everybody from City Year to KIP to Strive, all of these Moneyball all-stars advancing in these ideas. So following in the impressive footsteps of these folks, we appreciated the opportunity to sit and think about how could you really apply these Moneyball principles more specifically to education. And the aim of this was to identify a set of proposals that have bipartisan appeal and can make a practical difference in improving outcomes in education. We started, given some of our differences in the way we approach a lot of questions, with a couple of caveats, ground rules, if you will. One was that we assumed that the recommendations would be revenue neutral. That doesn't mean that they don't have a cost. Some of the recommendations clearly do have a cost. But the expectation is that the goal is not to increase education funding overall. It is to assume that the cost of these recommendations are found in shifting around education money from elsewhere in the budget. Second is that we don't assume that the federal government is going to dictate to the states or localities exactly how to spend their funds. Our premise is that federal government has a key role to play in promoting the use of data, evidence, and evaluation because these are classic public goods and they support the decisions made by local and state educators. The last one is that Moneyball strategies aren't about suggesting that we only value what can currently be measured, since our measures are limited right now, and also that we don't paint everything as either working or not working. The context and implementation of policy and practice often belie the simple notion that you're going to know that something is exactly right. So we want to embrace the complexity in this work. So when we started to talk about this with the smart folks that Rick mentioned, we quickly sort of started norming around some tenets, some thoughts that were guiding us as we were trying to come up with recommendations. I'm not going to go through each one of these. You can see them. They're fairly self-explanatory. But for example, clarify the outcomes. Oddly enough, in most federal programs and in most legislative proposals, there's very little clarity up front about what it is trying to achieve. It rarely says the goal of this is to increase graduation rates, and we'll know because we'll measure those. That would be helpful in knowing whether or not a program's successful. Recognizing the limits of measurement. We want our students to not just be literate and be able to do math, but also be creative and responsible and self-reliant. But these aren't always the easiest things to measure. And so we should resist as policymakers the urge to narrowly focus in on the few things we can measure. And as part of Moneyball, we should build the things that we need to measure, the things that we need to know if success is happening. This avoiding overly broad judgment of what works is back to the complexity issue. Often you're not going to know that Title I works, but you can know that certain interventions work. You may not know that the charter schools program works, but you can know that certain charter schools are more effective than others, and you can direct your funds towards the programs, the interventions, the organizations that deliver success. But trying to say that a large program, a large funding stream works is likely ineffective. Scaling based on evidence, programs should be expanded more intentionally in proportion to the evidence that they're having beneficial impact. Often programs are scaled based on political will and momentum, and not based on sort of evidence of impact on students. Building demand. I often in my career have spent a lot of time trying to build supply. The federal government just builds it, then people will come. But honestly, we need more demand for this kind of thing, and we need it to be building out in the states and localities, and how can we help support the building of that demand? And then number 10 is one of my favorites. It's that first do no harm. In a lot of places, we're actually creating barriers from the federal government to people who at the state and local level are trying to play Moneyball. So how can we make sure that we are removing those barriers and making this happen? So as Rick said from the beginning of our conversations about this work, it's really easy to agree on the broad generalities. It's going to get harder when we have to come up with some shared recommendations. And so he's kept saying the challenge is going to be in the fine print, but we actually managed to come up with 7 concrete recommendations, specific things that all have under them various examples and ways that they could move the ball forward in the Moneyball game. So you have a handout that has an overview front and back with these 7 in more detail. So I'm not going to go through them again in huge detail. But for example, devoting a portion of funds, the second one about how can we take, Bob Balfoun's did a paper for Results for America on this, how can we take $1 of the 100 we spend and make that other 99 have more impact? We really do need to be setting aside a share of program funding so that you can really do evaluation and research and know what's working and what's not, and direct investments more smartly. Another one is about the cost-benefit analysis. Comes down to that shared value of transparency. Having more information about what's going on is always better for everybody, and we're rarely able to do this cost-benefit analysis because we lack honest transparency into what's going on in education spending. That would be a big move forward if we could get there. Making education programs more evidence-based. We should revamp competitive and formula funding both to favor interventions that are effective and make a difference for kids. And we also need to build the evidence base using the competitive and formula funds that we give out from the federal government. We should also drive our dollars to these practices, these entities, these organizations that have a successful track record, and away from folks that don't. The Head Start Recompete is a good example of this. We've had Head Start grantees who for decades have been potentially producing no positive results for kids. Doesn't mean the whole program doesn't work, but it does mean we should identify the grantees that are working and give them more of the funds, move away from grantees that are not effective. There's an innovative approaches opportunity here. There's a lot of buzz these days about pay for success and the opportunity that creates to move the needle. And so we need to be open to those innovative approaches and look for new ways to play Moneyball. And then we think about allowing for pilot projects that are going to emphasize data-driven, evidence-based continuous improvement. Moving away from sort of one-size-fits-all, we're going to tell you how to do it, and towards the sort of performance partnership pilots that are underway by the administration now that say you have to have transparency, you have to have expectations of outcomes, you have to measure those outcomes, give feedback loops from the data you're collecting so that you can continuously improve the practice towards achieving those outcomes. So you'll find more detail about these in the paper, but we believe that together they could really help us on that, on this journey of trying to make Moneyball for education real. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Rick and our panelists so that they can take us into the next part of the conversation. Thank you.
All right, if the panelists would slide on up, we will jump into it. We've got a terrific panel for you guys today. Starting from my right and over, we've got John Bailey. John's Vice President of Policy for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, co-founder of Whiteboard Advisors, a strategic consulting practice. During the Bush administration, John served as Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. He has also served as the nation's Director of Education Technology and been a formal or informal advisor to 3 presidential campaigns. Next up is John King. John's current title is a mouthful. Senior Advisor, Delegated Duties of Deputy Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. Basically means that if you can't get a hold of Secretary Duncan, you want to try to get a hold of Mr. King. Previously, he served as Commissioner of Education for the state of New York. You may recall that John was dealing with a couple of slings and arrows in that role over the last few years. He's also served as Managing Director of Uncommon Schools, co-founded Roxbury Prep Charter School, and taught high school social studies in Puerto Rico and Boston. Cheryl Oldham is Vice President of Education Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and VP of Education and Workforce Program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Previously, she served for 8 years in the Bush administration in a variety of senior roles, including serving as Executive Director on the Spellings Commission on Higher Education back in 2006. And finally, we've got Jim Shelton, former Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Department of Education. He also served as the Executive Director of President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative. Previously, Jim co-founded Learn Now, was a partner at New Schools Venture Fund, and served as Program Director for Education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You guys have tackled these issues in a variety of roles over time. Kind of curious, these ideas are stuff that you all have been thinking about and wrestling with for a long time. When you think about low-hanging fruit, opportunities to do a lot better right now than we're doing, curious what's top of mind for you all? Anybody?
Reading is fundamental. I'll jump in. So one, I just want to start off by saying thanks for letting me be here, especially as a former. The second thing I'll say is that I love the paper. And the reason is that I think that, frankly, almost everything that's in the paper is actually the low-hanging fruit. There are probably 2 things that I would say are not low-hanging fruit. One is something that people don't like to talk about, which is the cost accounting standards. We are the only sector that does not, the social sector broadly, that does not have cost accounting standards. And why is that important?
And say a word about what you mean by cost accounting.
Sure. So in almost every industry, there is a way of actually accounting things that's different than normal financial accounting that lets you begin to understand and compare costs. You can compare them across companies in the sector. So think about the amount of devolution of someone said, well, that kind of tight controls. Well, no, there is nothing more devolved in our American enterprise system. Yet they have agreed so that they can compare with one another, that they're going to use the same kinds of standards so they can understand how their even most granular costs compare to each other. If you're talking about airlines, they know what their relative cost per seat mile is from one airline to the next so that they can understand it and know whether they need to improve, and so that people who invest in them can understand it and know where they stand relative to their peers. In every sector, telecommunications, et cetera, has some set of agreed upon standards like that lets you begin to dig deeply into and understand what the cost structure is, where you're getting benefit and where you're not getting benefit. The lack of that infrastructure is something that is one of the biggest things that gets in the way of us ever moving towards a system of understanding true cost effectiveness. The second thing that is the big lift is the capacity we actually need to build around efficacy. And I know I'm supposed to talk about the low-hanging fruit, but I just wanted to, I do think the other stuff is low-hanging fruit. We have underinvested in the enterprise of evaluation and the enterprise of really figuring out what works. We have treated this sector as if it is an art. The most important thing I think that gets left out about the story about Moneyball is it's great what everyone did with the statistics, but the most important thing that happened is there were all these people who had all this mythology about how you pick talent. Like literally the shape of the pitcher's face, right? And all of a sudden this data blew all of that crap away. People who had decades and decades riding on their expertise had to be confronted by the fact that time and time again, this data was saying, despite your closely held beliefs, there actually is a different answer. If there is any place that we need that kind of discipline, it is in this sector. But what we have failed to do is create the evaluation infrastructure and enterprise that can actually do that. And here's what I mean by that. We spend literally about 1% of what we spend in health and defense R&D on education R&D. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. Part of it is this belief set that we have, I think. The other part of it is, as I'll talk about later on, is that our market actually doesn't demand it. Like, I'm now looking at the private sector quite closely. It is very apparent to me that building a better, more effective product is not the fastest way to make money in this sector. And in fact, if you were in a sector like, let's call it criminal justice, your incentives are exactly the opposite. If the goal is to actually get people not to stay in the system, but to get out of the system after they've completed their time. So we've not invested properly in creating solutions that can actually work. If we do that, imagine if we just doubled it, which would be relative rounding error in our sector, we could have an entirely different enterprise. So I'm just going to say all the rest of this stuff is low-hanging fruit. Where we need to spend our energy is on the fights that need to come around those things. In particular, we'll talk more about, I'm sure, the data infrastructure.
John?
Great. Maybe I agree with everything Jim said, including the paper was great. I can't wait for Brad Pitt to play you in the movie. So this will be even better.
It's going to be a long wait.
It's going to be. Just building on Jim's comments, two things jumped out at me in terms of low-hanging fruit. One is this calling on the feds in particular, but just all of us in education to do a better job at zeroing in on data, particularly outcome data, and not just getting better outcome data, but I would sort of add to that and just underscore something that was mentioned in the paper, more timely data, right? Like IS produces lots of data out there, but there's often a lag. And a lag comes a little bit from actually what Jim was talking about, that there's an underinvestment because there's an underappreciation in this. And so, arguably a lot of data is collected, and just because of, bottlenecks within IS and lack of resources, data gets published, 2 years later. We would never sort of agree to that in healthcare data or even in job employment data, right? Like if BLS releases monthly, employment reports every 2 years, right? Think about it just would be crazy. And again, because we value that sort of data in those places. So I think the timeliness and the accuracy of it. And just to also build on something else that Jim was saying too, I think there's huge white space here in terms of better identifying, collecting, and reporting, and then marrying financial data with outcome data. Like we just don't have a good sense of ROI or productivity or the things that do give sort of the value that they were able to estimate in baseball. And so I think that's sort of a great white space for us to really sort of dive into, because it's the only way you're going to be able to get value. And we just do such a terrible job right now as a sector in terms of being able to sort of track how funds flow down to the kids, what interventions were used with those funds, and then marrying it with even the sort of the base outcomes that we have now.
And John, just to follow up on that, for those of us who haven't been on the inside, it seems like timeliness shouldn't be that hard. And it seems like tracking dollars better shouldn't be that hard. Why is it that we don't release those reports in as timely a fashion as somewhere else? Why is it we track the dollars the way
because again, I think it's what Jim was saying, that we underinvest in this area of our R&D generally, and then evaluations too in IS, and they have capacity problems. They collect a lot, and then also to get the rigor, I think that we also sacrifice a little bit of timeliness for rigor, and we have to maybe be open to slightly more higher margins of error in order to get timeliness. And also, it's just changing the culture. It's changing the way that we do things. And I think Jim mentioned this too. We have to create sort of a demand for it, right? Like I think unless states and education leaders and education reform sort of leaders are out there sort of demanding this and demanding it faster and better, then we're not going to see the government sort of respond to that. And we need to make more investments. I think, Jim, and you've made this point too in other papers, but we underinvest in education R&D in a dramatic way compared to for as no matter what lens you look through it, an economic lens, a social justice lens, a civil rights lens, the education crisis is one of these things that touches on so many different sectors, but we don't spend the R&D on it the way that you do on a lot of health challenges and other things. And so there's a bigger need for that.
Sure.
Just a little bit in response to what John was saying, I just wonder what the politics would dictate once you I mean, if you do invest heavily and you get this outcome data and you discover what, sort of investments at the federal level aren't working, I mean, is it that easy then to shut those things down? I just feel like, how this town works, it's like you create something, it's next to impossible to get rid of, and just, I don't know. I mean, it would certainly help inform and hopefully help make the case for those kinds of things. But the other thing I was thinking as I was reading the paper and then also just listening to Bethany is just what kept coming to mind was sort of Moneyball in the philanthropic sector or from the corporate investment side, I think would be wonderful. And I know this is sort of Moneyball in government, but, we sort of push the business community a lot or try to think about, outcomes and data-driven investments much more than maybe they have in the past. And I think there is definitely a move towards that, but I think it's a huge space where we ought to be thinking about how this type of thing could be better utilized by corporate investment. I mean, very generous, the business community is annually in education programs, but in the past we've seen just lots of sort of throw the money out for nice little things and not really driven by outcomes. So,
John, I mean, you've tackled these issues everywhere from the classroom to the federal government. Curious, where do you see the opportunities?
So one hopeful thing and two worrisome things. So one hopeful thing, on Monday I was at City University of New York where they are launching a college completion innovation fund funded by Dell Foundation, Capital One, Gutman Foundation, and they have essentially modeled this initiative after the same approach that Jim and others took with I3 and First in the World. They are investing in evidence-based initiatives to improve college completion. CUNY has a program called ASAP that MDRC has reviewed that literally doubled the 3-year graduation rate in community colleges through a set of supports for students. And so now they've created this innovation fund that will fund either new initiatives that try to build evidence about best practice or at a higher level of funding, a tier where they will fund scale-up efforts of things like ASAP. So I think there is a lot of potential to mobilize foundation dollars to support these kind of Moneyball initiatives. However, two worrisome things. To Cheryl's point, I worry a lot about the politics preventing implementation even when there is good evidence. So to use MDRC again as an example, very compelling MDRC evidence about the New York City strategy under Mayor Bloomberg and Chancellor Klein of closing the lowest performing schools and replacing them with new schools. But the political climate today in New York City is very different, and that strategy is essentially inconsistent with the current political moment, despite the overwhelming evidence about the improved outcomes for students. On the cost effectiveness level, Rick, Marguerite Rosa very well. Marguerite has written about how in some districts the per student spending on cheerleading is dramatically higher than the per student spending on improved academic outcomes for the lowest performing students. That is to say, you pay the veteran cheerleading coach one prep, that teacher is making a 25-year teacher salary. It's a huge amount of money for the 12 kids who are on the cheerleading team. If you look at the unit cost for cheerleading as opposed to the unit cost for the 40-student entry-level kids who are behind in math, 9th grade math class, cheerleading is getting a lot more dollars. But if any folks have been to a school board meeting recently, the politics of saying, let's cut the cheerleading squad, or maybe let's just have someone else coach it who isn't a 25-year veteran teacher with one prep. Let's have someone else coach it so that we can put those resources towards remedial math instruction. That's going to be a very difficult political lift. The other challenge I want to mention is the capacity problems at the federal, state, and local level. Does the federal government have the resources to do the evaluation and the data work efficiently to run an effective peer review process? Do states have any capacity to do this kind of work, which I would submit very, very little? And then do folks in districts and schools, are they familiar with the discipline of evidence-based practice? Is that part of teacher training, principal training? And I would submit it's really not.
I just want to jump back in on a few things that people talk about. First, I want to clarify, like, in case you were wondering what John's title means, it means he has all of my old work plus some and none of the glory. Like, that's basically what that means. A few things that came up during the conversation I think are really important. One, we talked about the political environment and the ability, frankly, to move forward on things. The reality is that one of the hidden gems in this is that it shifts two, hopefully, paradigms. One is, Bethany pointed out the importance of moving away from program level evaluation, which are largely ridiculous, to understanding how you evaluate the things that are below at the intervention level.
And say a word about why program level.
Yeah, so
Problematic.
think about it this way. Somebody yesterday said, well, we've evaluated the 21st Century Community Schools program for years and years, and it clearly doesn't work. It is literally thousands of different after-school programs doing almost all different things. What do you think you're going to learn from looking at 1,000 people doing 1,000 different things about the effectiveness of what any one of them is doing? So you probably have some people who are doing things that are extraordinarily effective, and other people who are doing things that couldn't actually add value if they tried. And yet we have no perspective on which of them should be getting resources versus don't. And most of our, actually, I won't even say that. Many of our programs don't even have the resources to do that, like to do that program level useless evaluation. And so that's the first point I want to take is, in order to change our political environment, I think we have to take on a couple of the things that have become a part of rhetoric that, frankly, don't hold water. To run programs over and over and over again and never have allocated the resources to evaluate the effectiveness of the things that are being funded. Literally, I ran the Office of Innovation and Improvement first. It is mostly a competitive grant programs. 85% of the programs in the office had never had enough resources because of the cap, the requirement that most of the program dollars go direct to direct service, had never been evaluated. How can you say, regardless of party, that you are for responsible government, have run demonstration programs for a decade and never spent the money to figure out what's working for whom and how to share the best practices? That is not responsible government. And it is not a political affiliation thing. It is just a simple fact. The same thing is true as you cannot say that you are for social justice and say that you want a precious few resources to be allocated to things that actually don't change people's lives. Like, we need to change the argument that lets someone say that they are for kids, for opportunity, for equity, and yet still aren't also about resource allocation to those things that are most effective. And there are people who are getting that and I think are ready to start to come out on it, but we've got to organize them and give them what they need to move forward. The second thing I'll say is that in this environment, I am not clear that any other structure has the promise of kind of allowing us to actually move towards things that actually improve lives getting done. Our country has such different views about how you actually solve problems that unless we can take it out of our strongly held beliefs, like people pick pictures before, to what the facts and the data actually say and just letting the dollars flow where they may, I'm not sure that we're going to find a way to find common ground that is more effective than this one. So recognizing how difficult it's going to be, and there's lots of political machinations that need to happen to make it so, I still think it is one of the most promising paths forward. The third thing I just want to end on is that it's very interesting on this corporations front that we have to have this conversation with them. Like, right? But I mean, and the reason I say that is that, like, I think the number was something like Google ran 13,000 RCTs in the last 2 years, but they ran them on how to improve the economics of their core business. Like, they know and understand deeply as enterprises how to use the infrastructure that they have to be very, very rigorous about how to drive the outcomes that they want. Just like corporations, and unfortunately I find this with many of the philanthropists who get into the business having had tremendous success in business, somehow those lessons don't swing over to their philanthropic work. And so helping to bridge that gap shouldn't be that hard. We just have to find smarter ways to get these smart people to actually see how to do it.
Cheryl, I'm curious kind of your take on this third point Jim raised.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about, I think a way to get at that is you start to see some companies who are aligning their philanthropic work with their sort of HR side of things, which Alcoa is one that has done that. And I think it informs greatly where they invest on the philanthropic side, and it's driven by what are our HR needs. And so then it helps them to, and they're not just at cross purposes. I mean, we see this all the time. I won't call out names, but where you have, very successful companies on one end doing things in the education, on the philanthropic side that are just like very nice to do's. And on the business side, it's just, I mean, we all know this, right? It's just, it's not their bottom line today, so you have to get them to understand it's their bottom line, tomorrow or in 5 years. I think a lot of them are changing that view because they do have real struggles today with skills and employees and finding the people with the right set of skills. It's harder in the K through 12 space. It's controversial, it's kids, they want to invest in the things that are warm and fuzzy. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day who said, well, charters are still real controversial. We don't want, I was like, are you kidding me? Like, where, in what world are charters controversial still? So, anyway.
So Cheryl, so one of the things that strikes me is, so some of these leading corporations that, have expressed a huge interest in educational leadership, when they think about hiring for their own purposes, they're constantly trying to iterate, figure out what are the qualities we're looking for, what makes somebody successful working in various roles at our organization. Yet, even when they get thoughtfully, and even when they're pretty brave about education advocacy, a lot of that same complexity and understanding of those Moneyball intuitions don't carry over. It becomes very much, we need good teachers. Any thoughts on how do we bring some of those same insights and that same constructive complexity into the way they think and talk about education?
So two things. I think that might have been a bit of a stretch when you said they're very thoughtful about the sort of who's a great employee, what sort of skills, what do I need? I mean, I think some do that really well, and I think some don't. I mean, we see this sort of just in the idea of, every job posting says I need a bachelor's degree. I mean, just because that's a sorting mechanism to tell me that person must know something. But are we really sophisticated? And we at the Chamber are trying through some programs and initiatives that we have going to help the employer community get more sophisticated about figuring out what are the skills and competencies and things that we need, and then how do we talk about them to training providers, the education community. How do we help that inform the partnerships that we engage in to better get that skilled workforce that we need? The other thing, I think, just to the second point is, the business community gets around a table with a bunch of really smart people in the education space, and it's like, intimidating as heck, right? I mean, I don't speak the language. I don't, all I can say is this is what I know and this is what I need in terms of, maybe employees or what I want for my community or what I want for my kids, but it gets very intimidating very fast, I think. And so how do you help them be more sophisticated about talking about this stuff? And we certainly have done a lot of this. I mean, Common Core is a great example. We've been very involved in promoting college and career ready standards. We've been working with our chambers across the country, and chambers are a little bit better. They're more sophisticated on the policy side. They're more engaged with state houses and, do a lot of advocacy and government relations. But I think at the corporate, sort of national corporate level, it's hard to find people who I think have invested maybe in staff that can help them navigate the policy world of education.
Jim, did you want to jump in there?
I just want to add 30 more seconds on that, because I think that's right. I find that corporations do their philanthropic investment around three things: either brand, benefits for engagement of their employees, and or they believe that what they can do has a direct impact. So this thing about actually filling their pipeline. And I think that the reality, especially of the vast majority focusing on brand and benefits and engagement, mean that there's not really a strategy other than getting a good publicity out of it. And somehow we have to shift the calculus for them about the level of impact actually being a way to amplify their brands and a better use of their employees' resources, be they dollars or time, when they focus on things that actually work, that the employees will feel better about doing things that are effective as opposed to just spending time. So there's more to it than that, but I do think that understanding what their incentives actually are is an important part to getting them to shift how they spend their dollars.
John Bailey, to change gears a little bit, one of the things that I heard you and Jim both talking about was infrastructure and investment. And I'm curious, kind of the Moneyball example, right? It took 25 years for them to be able to build the knowledge base that allowed the A's to start playing Moneyball. This crazy guy, Bill James, was doing this stuff in his basement with a mimeograph machine back in the 70s. And little by little, there were no federal programs investing in baseball analysis. It was kind of a private interest, and over time it grew up into an ecosystem of folks who were doing this. And what happened was they started tracking a whole lot of stuff besides home runs and runs batted in, and figuring out ways to get your hands around the game. I'm kind of curious, do we have the seeds of that kind of analysis in education today? Where is it? If so, if not, how do we kind of get that seed bed started?
It's a great question. And I mean, we're seeing that actually, I think, a little bit in football now. All this sort of started from hobbyists, right? Building up the statistical sets and then, getting used by the professionals. I don't think we can let education Moneyball sort of, be in the realm of the hobbyists. We have to think a little bit more how to systematize it. And also, I think, be comfortable with introducing this in smaller segments as opposed to saying, gosh, we can do this for 100% of all programs and 100% of all the states, right? I mean, Jim's example of Google and just the Silicon Valley sort of mindset right now is you just do lots of testing and lots of data analysis, lots of A/B testing on a frequent basis, and we're seeing those platforms deployed in education. It's just not it's not uniform yet, right? And so I think we need to start with where we have those beachheads and sort of build from there. And again, keep investing in the state longitudinal data grants that the department gives out. I think helps build up some of the state capacity. I think one, it's an off-looked mechanism, but forcing states and school districts to adopt open data policies. This is different than like data privacy, where you're releasing personally identifiable information to kids, but performance data and finance data and outcome data should be available in data sets that anyone out there can take and sort of manipulate and be able to run their own analysis on.
Now, one of the pushbacks on this that I hear, and I'm pretty sympathetic to, is that it sounds like when we're talking about productivity, we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about reading and math scores, maybe graduation rates, best case, maybe earnings downstream, that's what education is when we do Moneyball. Is that fair? Or how do we think about what are we measuring?
I think the reason we have that is the criticism is because those are the limited data sets that we have right now, right? I think if there are more focused investments in effort given to broadening those data sets, and again, thinking of different ways to calculate it, right? We don't think in terms of ROI that if we're able to get a kid to read proficiently by the end of the third grade, what cost does that save us later on in high school? With really expensive dropout recovery programs, credit recovery programs, like there's, we don't think of it in that sort of terms, right? And that has nothing to do necessarily with math scores or with reading scores, but it's about sort of costs and funds and other sort of more efficient ways of delivering education. But again, I think going back to some of these new platforms, you can get all sorts of other new data down about in terms of student engagement, student beliefs in themselves and what they see in terms of their academic trajectory, both in high school and after high school. So I think there's a lot of other sort of softer sort of outcomes that can help sort of inform sort of the harder outcomes too.
John King, I'm kind of curious. I mean, you obviously, you have been on the ground level thinking about this. You've been in the state. If we think about some opportunities to talk about playing Moneyball other than just what's the most effective way to kind of move kids forward in reading and math, are there some other opportunities that strike you, some places that we might think about that we haven't?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of our challenge is to how do you build kind of evidence culture where people at every level are thinking about how evidence might inform what they do next. So a good example of this we were talking about before, Doug Lamov has written this book, Teach Like a Champion, where basically his strategy was go to classrooms of teachers who are getting great outcomes for kids, watch what they do, and try to figure out how they get those outcomes, and try to observe the small changes in behavior that translate into significant benefit for kids. So one example is great teachers to have a routine for distributing papers. Why is this important? Well, because you distribute papers multiple times a day. Imagine an elementary school classroom. You're handing out materials. You're handing out everything from scissors and glue to math papers to paper for students to write on. So over the course of the day, you're distributing paper multiple times. Now, if you can cut the time of that paper distribution exercise in half or by 2/3, think about how much time that adds each day, then each week, and over the course of the school year. And Doug's what Doug saw was that you could save thousands of minutes of time for instruction by having a better routine. I was talking with someone at the department about this yesterday, and she said we need to do that at the department. Teach a common routine for paper distribution, right? So that's one example, but there are many around how you might think differently about teaching if you thought about it as a more science than just art. It is clearly both, but there is this notion in schools, like some people are good and some people are terrible and just is. But actually it's more complicated than that. Deborah Ball, who teaches about math at University of Michigan, has this idea of content teaching, content knowledge for teaching. And she makes the point that not every set of numbers is a good way to teach a concept, right? You wouldn't use a random number generator to come up with what numbers to use to teach how to multiply fractions. It actually matters which numbers you choose because there are ways that make the problem more or less complicated, and you want to teach particular ideas to your students. And that knowledge of what's the best way, what's the best model, what's the best example, that's teachable. That's something that we ought to be preparing teachers around, but we aren't. And I think that's a gap in our culture of schools.
So, John, let's stay with this for a moment, because I think this strikes me very much in the spirit of the paper that, as you guys have noted, when we talk about Moneyball, there's kind of this general notion that, geez, we ought to measure what works. But like Jim said, we're talking about, Title I. Does Title I work? Does Head Start work? I mean, I can think of so many millions of variables that it's hard to get a confident thumbs up or thumbs down. But this actually sounds much more in the spirit of where we've seen progress. That, the question is not, is this guy a good player, but how valuable is it that this person takes the first pitch of each at bat rather than swinging at that first pitch? And there's things you can do that help an okay player become a better player and that help you identify who's going to be a good player. So I'm curious, kind of, if we think about particularly those intuitions as one powerful strand we haven't played with very much, how do we get the ball going on that? Is there an appropriate federal role? Is this something that really ought to be philanthropy-driven? How do we do this in a way that's constructive?
Yeah, Jim should really build on this, but I will say, I think if you create incentives around evidence-based outcomes, you help create a culture where people want to find these things out, right? And I think part of the challenge is we have a culture now where your money is pretty much guaranteed. You're going to get your money next year for your program, for your initiative, and so there's not really an incentive to go figure out, hey, why is the person next door getting much better outcomes? At Roxbury Prep, we outperformed not only all the other schools in Boston, but we were outperforming with African-American Latino students, overwhelmingly low-income students. We were outperforming the most affluent suburbs of Boston. And I thought, well, now people are going to be rushing to come visit and see what we're doing. Crickets, right? Because there isn't necessarily an incentive to go find out why someone's effort is better than another, because we haven't built the right culture.
Jim?
So I want to, I think, love everything that John just talked about, and I want to build on one particular point and then talk about the infrastructure. This notion of, we often talk about outcome-based funding and the evidence work as if they're related but separate things, and they're actually the same. And here's what I mean by that. Like the best deal for a taxpayer, frankly for anybody, is to pay for only when you get what you want, right? So we want a graduate. I pay you when you get me a graduate, and I pay you more if you give me a graduate that was probably not likely to be a graduate than I will for a really easy graduate. But I pay you based on that outcome, and if you can't deliver on the rest of it, then I get to save that money. Lots of problems with going all the way there. So what do? What's the next best thing? The probability of that outcome. And that's all evidence is. All evidence is, am I going to invest in something that has the probability that I am paying for the outcome that I want? And so aligning these systems so that actually more and more it looks like we're paying for getting the outcomes that we want. And in the meantime, we're figuring out how we get closer and closer and closer to always delivering that outcome. That is the incentive system that we need to imagine that we're trying to create as we put all these pieces together. Now, what does it look like to begin building that infrastructure? This is why I say the low-hanging fruit is in the paper. We already have the seedlings of this stuff, right? I mean, these tiered evidence-based programs, the evidence-based programs in health, in places where you're evidence-rich, it can look different than it does in places where, like education, you're not very rich in education in evidence at all. But what needs to start to happen is that our basic dollars need to be spent, whether philanthropic or public, on when we fund projects. They need to be both looked at in terms of, I'm always surprised that people think I3 was really innovative. Because here's the core concept. I'll ride it for a long time, but the core concept is you get a little bit of money if you have a little bit of evidence. You get a lot of money if you have a lot of evidence. Like, that is not rocket science, right? But how many of our programs work that way? How many of our programs use evidence on the front end to determine whether you're going to get access to dollars? How many of them require that you do an evaluation on the back end to see if it actually worked? Now, we have demonstration grant funding and formula funding in almost every agency in the government. And yet, in most of them, those two things are not connected in any form. Like, you run demonstration demonstration program after program after program after program, and never does it change the way the big $1 billion that flow out in formula are spent. Why should that be? Shouldn't that be a continuous system? Shouldn't you have demonstration grant programs that have something that looks like a tiered evidence structure, where you have a big pipeline that then vets things to see if they deserve to go to the next level, that then vets things to see if they deserve to get access to those big pools of funding? And even if you don't want to make the entire pool of funding tied to whether or not you have evidence, even if you just made in these big programs, like 10% of Title I, where you wind up creating a $1 billion+ market based on performance, which evidence is, you create an incredible market pulling mechanism for people to get in the business of delivering better outcomes.
So, John Bailey, so if you have a point on that, that's great. Also, I'm kind of curious. For those of us who tackle this as conservatives, I love in principle everything Jim just said. This sounds spot on to me. But I also find myself with real mixed emotions, because I know that I, for one, was nervous about, for instance, how Race to the Top played out. I worry about any federal administration playing too large a role in terms of dictating, because they're just so far removed from. How do you think about helping kind of conservative policymakers wrestle with these competing tensions?
So a couple different thoughts. I mean, one, just to come back, I mean, what Jim was saying about measuring, and I had to live this when I was at the Department of Ed, and we had to measure the ed tech program. So we were part of what Moneyball, the book and the paper talked about in terms of the PART process in the Bush administration, try to measure program effectiveness. And it was hugely problematic, because there's a tension between the more flexibility you give states and locals with funds, it makes it more difficult to sort of help track some of the outcomes. So the ed tech dollars could be used literally everything from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade, from buying a smartboard to doing a blended learning classroom or an online AP course. And trying to measure the whole program effectiveness based on that wide use of funds was hugely problematic. And again, I think it goes back, not all the grantees had the capacity to sort of report on this too, right? They all had to report on an evaluation, but again, it was not it's not the type of evaluations that Jim was just talking about here. So there's a capacity problem through the whole pipeline. Coming back to how do you square that? Like, I don't know if this I mean, obviously everyone sort of jumps that it needs to be sort of part of the federal programs, but this needs to be part of state policy as well. And the pay for success, I think is something that immediately could start being done. You don't want to make this binary. You don't want to make it just, some formula funds and some competitive funds, and then, so by the way, you have these pay for success funds. You can attach reward funds on top of existing formula and other sort of programs, so that, again, without any sort of heavy-handedness in terms of directing the design of the intervention, you're creating incentives that, we don't really care how you do it, but if you decrease dropout rates, increase graduation rates, if you increase proficiency or, double your growth, like, you'll get these, an extra couple dollars per kid or per school. I mean, ways to create sort of an incentive that they're still in charge. States and locals are still in charge of the design of it, but you're using your limited funds at the federal and also at the state level to pay for the successful reaching of those different outcomes. I mean, we've tried that a little bit in higher education. It's being used a lot in other areas where there's a lot of frustration with government spending. So foreign aid, you had the Millennium Challenge account, healthcare. I mean, it's time for us to sort of start playing with this a little bit in the education space. And also, as a conservatives should jump on this, because if you're going to, and again, not in the design of the intervention, but in the fiscal responsibility, right? So that fiscal conservatives can't say decry the spending and the waste, and then somehow sort of pull back when it comes time to invest in areas that have deeper and more investment. Doesn't mean we don't create rooms for innovation and rooms in space to try out new things, but for the big dollars, we have to sort of start paying, I think, more for successful outcomes and not just for the hopes and promises that eventually we'll get to those outcomes.
I agree with everything John said. I just want to flag kind of a risk as this notion of evidence-based gets more broadly adopted, which is sort of brand dilution. So I've seen a couple times in recent weeks state or local initiatives with the brand evidence-based that aren't. Right, where actually they're using evidence-based to mean the opposite, right? They're advocating for doing something that actually has been shown not to work, but they call it evidence-based because this is a political moment in which that sounds right. And so a question, I think, for all of us from inside and outside government is how do we maintain some level of rigor around what evidence-based means? Bless you. How do we ensure that when we talk about having more evidence, we mean RCTs. We mean sort of a degree of kind of rigor about the controls, rigor about how people are selected for participation, so that we don't lose this the way that research-based is now on every label of every program that you would want to buy.
Well, and this actually flags something which I think I'd just love to hear a couple of y'all thoughts on, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Is one of the things we heard from participants as we were kind of doing a couple of these groups is folks don't necessarily trust, as I mentioned before, the outcomes that we're looking at. They can worry that the outcomes are too narrow. They don't necessarily trust the scorekeeper. And there were concerns, both in the case, say, of Reading First under the Bush administration and then I-3, the judging process had to be kind of put together on the fly. So if you were going to, in the sense that if you look over at NIH, for instance, or at NSF, there are decades-long protocols and who gets to serve as a judge and how they judge. And in Reading First and I-3, you didn't have that kind of infrastructure in place. So I'm kind of curious, if you wanted to be able to do this stuff with more stability and more bipartisan buy-in, are there strategies or ways to go around building out that infrastructure? Jim?
So a couple of things. One is that I think that to both this point and to John's point, one of the most important things for us to do as a sector is to actually agree on these evidentiary standards and what makes for what levels of rigor. And what was very interesting was it was much easier for the Department of Education to come to agreement with the National Science Foundation on a shared set of evidence standards than it was with the other social service agencies. But that now there's actually been a ton of progress on that. When you want to actually devolve, though, the ability for anyone, states, districts, to make these decisions with a tremendous amount of flexibility, the only thing really that you need to hold constant is the outcome metrics that you're going to measure and the evidence standards that you're going to use to determine whether something was rigorous enough to meet the level of scrutiny that you're describing that it did. So agreeing on the evidence standards and then proliferating them through both the federal, state, and local infrastructure, that's the first step in this process. The second thing is you did talk about in terms of the need to build out an infrastructure, and I want to make distinctions. I don't think anyone had any problems with the decisions that were made about whether something made the evidence threshold or not. The question becomes, if you have scarce resources, then you choose on other factors beyond that. And in that context, that's when you get peer reviewers and others in there trying to figure out how it works. The irony here is that our process of I'm outside now, so I'll say it. Our process of trying to make everything really fair by using distant peer reviewers means that you've done everything to try and increase fairness and everything to reduce judgment. And so many of the science agencies you will find actually have their scientific program officers play much heavier roles because they are paid to be expert in their area about what is going to add value to the field, what is not adding value to the field, where have other studies been done that have already demonstrated this didn't work and versus others. They lean in actually much more heavily than anything that we ever did. So though there's more distrust, the infrastructure looks different in order to make sure you build on expertise. But the reality is that the conversation that we can have around this is one that conservatives should jump on, because it not only removes the federal bureaucrat from trying to judge how you design the programs best. Frankly, it takes, I hate to say it, our people who are creating policy from trying to design programs inside legislation. If you can create the infrastructure and a set of priorities that you want to learn about, have the data infrastructure to allow for evaluation, and then say the dollars are going to flow where they may based on the outcomes, recognizing we need to keep getting better on the outcomes, you can free everyone to do whatever looks best without political infighting. That's a little naive, but with less political infighting. I'll let others go.
So, the one word that was used in the paper about this is trust, right? You need a trusted entity. And I think we've been spending a lot of time thinking about trust in terms of student data privacy, but it's a word that gets bandied about, but it's really hard to define it, much less sort of build against it, right? So how do you, because trust is something that's transactional. You can't just sort of legislate, thou shalt trust IES, right? But somehow when you think about it, why do we trust NIH more than, the Department of Ed with a grant program? Why do we trust BLS data or BEA data than we do IES data? And there's a lot of this, I think, comes to it's transactional. Trust is something that has to be earned, and it comes from I think sort of evidence over time that and I think there's different ways to sort of help build that trust. I think the paper's recommendations about sort of parking some of these responsibilities in IAS that has a little bit of a separation from even perceived political influence, because I think Jim mentioned this a little bit, but that is just the sad reality of kind of where we are as a country with politics, is that it doesn't matter who's in the White House or who's at the Department of Ed. Someone is not going to trust the political apparatus there. And as we've seen with Common Core, as we've seen with a lot of other sort of policies, these don't become policy debates. They become very emotional political debates. And you're oftentimes having to try to create a process that can sort of build that trust and protect that trust against what is often like hypothetically very far off sort of theories about sort of nefarious activities and that sort of thing. But I think we have to sort of just acknowledge that we're in that environment, and then again trying to isolate it a little bit more by putting things over in IES and sort of separating it from a political apparatus that's over at the Department of Ed. No matter how well intentions, people sort of read all sorts of nefarious sort of involvement there in terms of putting fingers on a scale and changing the process to help in some sort of way. And these rumors spread faster than the evidence that we're trying to help sell here. So.
Well, there's just more political appointees in all those places. I mean, I don't know, what is NSF is probably like maybe the head of NSF, the appointee. I can't even remember, but IES, it's just the head. There aren't a lot of appointees sort of that change with the politics, so that helps.
So let's go ahead and open this up. We got a couple of mics floating around. Catch Elizabeth's eye or Isaac's eye. Be kind enough to introduce yourself by name and affiliation, and ask folks actually to ask a question. If we get 15 seconds in, I don't see one, we'll give somebody else a shot. Elizabeth?
My name is Mark Nadell. I had a question about whether there's an assumption we're making that unfortunately is not true, and that is that the schools are to serve the students. Michelle Rhee tried to do that in Washington, D.C., and found out that there were other stakeholders very powerful. And John pointed out two things. Roxbury, you produced the right results, but why didn't the parents support that? And when Bloomberg closed the schools in bad areas and replaced them with better schools, why wasn't there the support? So my question is, what do we need to do to get is it voters or parents who see results, there's no dispute, but they should support that rather than what are they doing now? They're supporting something else. They're going for a different.
Okay. Thoughts?
I don't have an answer for that, but I will. I was thinking about that when Rick made a comment about sort of his being uncomfortable with sort of dictating things from the federal level because, much better to have the folks that are closest. But you have those exact issues with the people that are closest to all these schools, which is it's emotional, it's my community. I'm not going to shut down a school because it's around the block. It's where my kid goes. I trust this teacher, even though I know, and I've seen it for 20 years. We're not graduating kids. We're failing them. Every year after year after year, and the politics becomes so hard that you can't even use the evidence that you have. I mean, we know this about chronically low performing schools across this country, and we can't even, shut them down and try to do, like what they're trying to do in Arizona, which I think is maybe a first step at sort of taking some of this Moneyball stuff, which is what Lisa's doing with the Arizona Chamber and otherwise, to sort of say, we know what we can sort of try to replicate those schools that are doing really great by the hardest to serve students in Arizona, instead of just, those are the schools we ought to be replicating and we ought to be shutting down. But anyway, I don't know the answer to your question, but that's what I fear when, I get that whole closest to the people, but.
We ask the parents in these low-performing schools, what do they need to hear? What evidence do they need that would convince them to make the change?
So I think there's one, Cheryl, I'm also curious. When I think about, say, the Moneyball analogy, right? There's never been a Major League Baseball team that was closed down on account of poor performance. That wasn't the issue. And the folks the sabermetricians who came up with this stuff faced a lot of political pushback. This is not the way the game was played. There were generations of scouts and ball players and general managers who laughed at this stuff. But it wasn't right. So there's politics in all of these things, right? And what's interesting there, as it seems to me, is the logic of Moneyball was about doing what you're already trying to do better. And it seems to me in education, we often talk about performance as whatever you're doing, stop doing. Let's go imitate what somebody else is doing over at place X, which feels to me almost antithetical to Moneyball, because it's not how do you identify this low-hanging fruit that John was talking about, but it's let's go cut and paste a model that happens to work for another school in another locale. How do you wrestle with that personally?
I don't know. I guess I'm so struck by just thinking about the schools that we know have failed our kids for so long. And so we know what's not working. So I don't know, maybe it's just, we keep trying to do, and if it's just model something that's working somewhere else, maybe it's got to be better than what's happening now. So I don't know. I don't have an answer.
John?
Two observations. One is, I think in your baseball analogy, if you're a GM and you said, actually, I don't think any of this statistics stuff matters very much, and I think I just got losing players, and they're going to keep losing, but I intend to be the GM here for 25 years. That probably wouldn't work out so well for you, right? And so I think part of it is, how do you create an incentive structure where people feel like, oh yeah, that team is outperforming me. I better go find out what they're doing so I can get better. And I'm not sure we've created that incentive structure in the sector. From a parent perspective, I think so my board chair in New York, one of the things that she did, a group of parents came to her and asked her to lobby then Mayor Bloomberg against closing a school. And she said, I'm against horrible schools, but I'll do it for you if you do one thing for me, which is come with me to visit a high-performing school that serves a similar population of kids. And so she got a van and she took this whole group of parents to go visit a high-performing school serving a similar population of kids. And they stopped asking her to help advocate to keep this other school open. And so part of it is, I think, if you are in a community where the schools haven't been failing for a year or 5 years or 10 years, but literally generations, it's very hard to imagine what different would look like. And I think we've got to figure out how we show people what it could be.
Okay.
I'm I'm Rob Lippincott. After many years in the public sector, I've been working at something called I2 Capital Group, which is impact investment. We're trying to use what Jim called the pull-through incentive of private investment. What is your advice about what statistics or outcomes, what Moneyball figure should we be trying to sell to private investors? Is it college completion? Is it job certification? Is it where can we promise that money will be placed in order to pull through the outcomes we want?
So, I mean, my best advice on this, I'm looking pretty hard at this issue already, is, and the people who looked at social impact bonds have kind of got a head start on it, is that the reality is that there needs to be a real, for your case, an economic incentive from the increased performance. So let me give you an example, right? Like there is a real economic incentive for states now who have finally realized that the amount that they spend on prison systems is extraordinary and it's eating up everything else. And that if they can find ways to reduce recidivism rates, that they actually will improve the overall economics of the state. So that has then created the incentive for folks first to start with social impact bonds, but also to be thinking about how do we create an incentive structure for providers that is different than keep as many people in as long as you can as possible, right? You need to look for those segments in the marketplace where that kind of economic return is realized very quickly by the people who are making decisions about how they're going to distribute the funds that get paid. Because in the end, you can actually create a place in the market where you're going to get a little bit of money for a little while, but if you really want an explosive growth opportunity, which is what I think we ultimately want, then you've got to find something that's going to have the potential to open up a new marketplace. The second thing I'd say is that it's really important for the sector, the for-profit education, training, human capital development sector, to recognize that if they ever want to get away from the stigma of being for-profit, that a results-based marketplace is the only way to get there, right? Because it's so deeply embedded in us that people should not make money off our kids. But the reality is that, you know, and for most part, in local context in particular, like, it's a fixed price good, right? Often an outside provider will get a little bit less. So the only thing that people will be able to see if we have the right metrics is, are you producing a better outcome for the same price or less? Once you start producing a better outcome for the same price or less, people will stop caring a lot more about what happens to the rest of the money. Not completely, but a lot less. But if you don't have that, and we stay in the world of ideology, there is no place for traditional education companies to go in the actual provision of services that change people's lives.
Isaac?
Hi, so we have a question from Twitter. Caitlin Farrell says, it seems like much of Moneyball for Ed focuses on the supply side of evidence. What about the demand side and optimal conditions for use?
Yeah.
John?
No, I'd agree on, I think that's been a theme actually from all the panelists and from the paper today too, is that you need to create a demand for this. I think how we communicate, I used to, when I was at Whiteboard, we did some work with some corporate folks trying to make an impact, as Jim was saying, sort of making an impact with their giving, but we make outcomes so difficult for people to understand, right? So if you just think of like NAEP scores and then add to that like, you know, PISA and TIMS and Pearls, and it's these numbers that mean a lot in this room, but mean absolutely nothing to moms and dads, much less to even, you know, corporate and other philanthropies that want to make a difference. So some of this isn't just about sort of releasing the raw outcomes, but making it easier to understand so that there is a way to galvanize some demand for this as well. I think part of that, we get, and it's part of the reason I think parents sometimes gravitate to the easy to understand metrics, and they use that as a proxy, right? So spending per student is a proxy for a whole bunch of different things because it's really complicated to sort of explain some of the other types of student outcomes. We need to do a much better job at that. One thing we just experimented with too was trying to engage the design community on this. So, you know, designers have a way of taking complex information and data and visualizing it and boiling it down to its most intuitive self. And I don't think we take advantage of that community well enough. And so we did a competition to try to engage them to reimagine what a school report card would look like in terms of student outcome measures. And it's radically different from what a lot of states produce right now, which are just spreadsheets. lots of numbers, but information poor. So I think that's part of helping to stimulate the demand.
John, on the demand side too, I mean, right now we're inundated with spring training baseball stories about players who are looking for tape, right? They watch hundreds of their own at-bats or the pitches they throw, and they put these money. How do you generate that demand among educators and among school and district education leaders to want to get their hands on, say, the kind of stuff that John was talking about in terms of where there are easy opportunities for them to serve kids a lot better?
It's a great question. It's a great point too, because I mean, some of this is about, again, not just trying to force things on teachers, but how do you create incentives for them to seek out value and how to improve their, sort of incremental value or exponential value. I think some of this goes back again to creating an incentive structure that sort of is loose on the design and the prescriptions of telling people what to do, and instead saying, gosh, you want this extra sort of performance bonus, you want this extra sort of rewards fund, then figure out the best way to sort of, add incremental value on a growth measure, a productivity measure, a student outcome measure, and if you achieve it, no matter how you achieve it, we'll pay out the bonus for it. But I think that's the way. I think what we do is we find something that works in a handful of places, and then we try to sort of bake that into legislation and say, thou shall do all these different things. And then we're curious, like, why it doesn't work. And it's because it's really hard to sort of legislate, behavior. I think folks, they respond more to incentives, particularly if we can sort of align the incentives with their pay and with some of their base funding there. There's a great example of this, just real quick, that happened with, I forgot the year it happened, but it was with the British Empire was trying to ship prisoners from Britain to Australia. So I forgot why this was, but the prisoners kept dying on the boats. And so the government was struggling with how do you keep the prisoners alive? And they instituted all this sort of forced procedures. They said, okay, we should have a doctor on it. And then all of a sudden an economist one day said, what if we paid for, not paid for how many prisoners were shipped, but how many prisoners actually arrived alive? And all of a sudden the rates went up to like 90%. And so it's because people respond to incentives. And so if we can do it with prison ships, God, we should be able to do it with education and reading and math and a handful of other things. Is that on Twitter?
Scary similarities here. All right, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. My name's Todd Borgasani, and I'm with Friendship Public Charter School. And we've got probably about 5,000 students in pre-K through 12. We're designing a performance measurement framework specifically for STEM extended learning environments. And so your thoughts as they would relate to after-school performance, experiential learning, and STEM education, anything that comes to mind would deeply help us.
Yeah, I mean, here's the reason. The reason is that, like, it's such a broad area that trying to without a whole lot more context give you any specific feedback about how to think about a performance framework would be pretty much BS for me, at least.
So for us, what we're doing is
Ash, you know what? Let's follow up after the event, just because we're close to the end. I want to get Michelle up here. Great, fantastic question. I think exactly the right kind of question, which is how do we not just talk about how to more effectively do the simple stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So let me build on that demand question just for a second, because I think it's really important for us to remember that in our sector, in most cases, there are multiple levels of purchaser, right? And actually, in that cases, not multiple levels of purchaser. There's a purchaser, and then there's an adopter, right? So in a district, there is a chief academic officer, if you're lucky, if not a procurement officer, who makes a decision about what actually gets acquired. And that is a business-to-business sale, if you will. And there's a different way that you actually influence that buyer community to make decisions than it is how you inform the mass market. And we ought to be thinking about not just how we speak to parents and teachers about the value of this stuff, but these people who are making the multi-million-dollar decisions, how do we build it into their incentive structure and their understanding of how they ought to be doing work to do that? And I want to build on two analogies that we heard today. One is obviously in the medical sector, and the other is this thing about teams and performance athletes. Like Moneyball pointed out that people used to think that, you're either a good athlete or not. There's not a whole lot of science in it. And then all of a sudden, people started realizing, wait a minute, there is a certain way to train that actually gets you to be a better batter, a better thrower, a better catcher. And it's all these micro shifts in performance, all these micro shifts in the tools that you use that allow you to be better and better and better at what it is that you do. There are a few people who are as hungry as I know for looking for that next best thing than good teachers. Like, they are relentless. They just don't have the tools. And we can get the designers in, but 5-star systems seem to work pretty well for lots of systems. And so if we can create real transparency and then have evidence and what level of evidence and what level of impact and how easy it is to implement be rated by folks who are actually doing the work, my guess is we'll see a transparent marketplace start to evolve really, really quickly. So what we have to keep in mind, how do we make it simple for them? How do we make it transparent for them? And then how do we influence these people that are actually controlling what they get access to?
All right. To take us out, I want to invite up Michelle Jolin. Michelle is CEO and co-founder of Results for America, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Previously, she served as senior advisor for social innovation at the White House in 2009 and 2010. And she's former chief of staff for President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. Michelle.
So, in keeping with the theme of the day, I'm the cleanup batter. Is that right? Did I say that right? I'm not a baseball person. So my most important job as a cleanup batter is to say thank you to this extraordinary panel. Bipartisan agreement, wow, rare, and makes me feel deeply optimistic about the potential of this agenda to deliver better outcomes for kids. Thank you to Rick Hess and his team. It's been an absolute pleasure, as it always is, to work with you and to have you push us and challenge us and keep us rigorous and thoughtful. So thank you. Thank you to Bethany Little on behalf of RFA for leading this. It's been really great to still have you part of the team. Thank you to Bloomberg Philanthropies for funding this and our Invest in What Works policy series. And thank you to Jeremy Ayers, our Vice President for Public Policy, for Results for America. He's just our superstar leader on this front. So obviously, we heard today from the panel many of the opportunities and many of the challenges. The challenges are there. The politics is real. The fact that there isn't a demand side is as well developed as perhaps we need. The political will, having the evidence certainly isn't enough on any front to do what's right. The expertise, how to implement, how to manage the transition to evidence-based practice. John Bailey talked about the capacity problems. He talked about the need to make outcomes more transparent and more clear so that we're talking about things that actually matter to people. And I liked his phrase about lots of numbers, but we are information poor. John King talked about the challenge of maintaining rigor about what we mean about evidence, and so all of these are significant challenges and things to keep highlighting, keep thinking about as we think about how to expand this agenda. But we also know that there's extraordinary opportunities here, and the fact that there's bipartisan agreement that we need to have more data and evidence itself points to an enormous opportunity. John King talked about needing culture change. He talked about the Roxbury School example, which I think was really powerful. The fact that it had outperformed peers, there was this expectation that there would be, this flood of people wanting to understand and learn, and then, being disappointed that there wasn't some that sort of interest level. Just because something works doesn't mean people are going to sort of try and do it. The incentives aren't quite there. John Bailey talked about the need to incent states to behave this way, to reward states with extra dollars and the money to make it more outcomes oriented. And then Jim talked about, if we're for kids, if we're for opportunity, if we're for equality, then we need to think about how our precious few resources are spent. I think that was just a great way to sum this up. This is all about responsible government. This is all about good outcomes for kids. So today, in the spirit of bipartisanship, building on the bipartisanship of this panel, we want to also announce that Senator Warner from Virginia and Senator Kelly Ayotte from New Hampshire have agreed to be all-stars. They've agreed to work with us more closely on this Moneyball for Government campaign. We're super excited about that. They're both very committed, thoughtful people on this front. So we're excited about that. They are going to help us up our game in the public sector and on other fronts. And so thank you again. Thank you, AEI. Thank you to our panel for your great remarks and your thoughtful sort of laying out of the challenges and opportunities. So, and thank you all to our audience for sticking with us and reading the report and enjoying our panel with us. So thank you.